Thank you all for coming. I'm Alec Holcomb, the director of Ohio University's Contemporary History Institute. This annual Elizabeth Evans Baker Peace Talk was made possible by the generosity of the Baker family. Elizabeth Baker, who lived from 1902 to 1990, was the wife of John Calhoun Baker, the president of Ohio University from 1945 to 1961. She and her husband came to Athens after the conclusion of World War II and were profoundly affected by that conflict. And to further the cause of peace in the world, Elizabeth promoted the establishment of peace studies institutes and programs at 3 universities, including, of course, OU. In a similar spirit, she threw herself into the cause of anti-nuclear war activism. And past Baker Peace Talks have tended to focus on topics related to international relations. This year we decided to take a domestic detour back to one of this country's most potent instruments of soft power, our American university system. For decades, athletic competition has been an integral part of the American collegiate experience. But in the past few years, as I'm sure most of you have seen, a handful of court cases have changed collegiate sports in ways that were almost unimaginable, I think, just 20 years ago. And terms such as conference realignment, the transfer portal, and NIL have become part of this country's everyday vocabulary. However, the transformations going on in college sports, I think, still have not reached a point of stasis. I can't think of a person better qualified than our guest speaker tonight, Columbia University professor Len Elmore, to help us better understand where collegiate sports came from and where they may be headed. Professor Elmore was an All-American collegiate basketball player at the University of Maryland before embarking upon a 10-year NBA career. After retiring from the NBA, Professor Elmore attended Harvard Law School and began a legal career that involved stints as a public prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York, as a senior counsel for several noted law firms, and as a leader in a sports management company. Professor Elmore also remained connected with the sports world through work as a television broadcaster of collegiate and NBA basketball games. Thus, he brings to his analysis the rare combination of legal knowledge, business sector leadership, and athletic experience. So it's an honor to have Professor Elmore with us tonight. Would you please join me in welcoming him?
Alec, thank you so much. First of all, let me tell you that it's a pleasure and an honor to join you tonight. And I'm hopeful that this talk can be thought-provoking, it can be informative, and most importantly, it can really raise some questions among you all. And because at the end, we're going to ask you to join, to ask questions, to share your thoughts. First of all, let me ask real quick, how many athletes are in with us today? Just a couple. All right, so, there's not going to be a whole lot of partisanship, if I will, in this. But we've got a lot to cover, so let me get started here. Based upon its history and contribution to American society, college athletics can be considered an institution. When deciding whether an institution is worth saving, we ought to start looking at its redeeming value. We ought to weigh its importance to society and community and selfishly to us individually. Now, the original intent of college athletics was to supplement formal higher education. It was provided to balance inactivity for college students, and quite honestly, it was to complement rigorous classroom learning. But when you tie college sports to the education mission, I believe that college athletics is the equivalent to a public trust. Now, some of you are going to ask, what is a public trust? Well, it's got a number of definitions. The one I like is the term of art version of public trust, and that is it designates cultural resources for the beneficial use of the public. Now, I also believe that protection of a public trust is certainly a responsibility of the public, and also its custodians, as well as even government. Now, higher education has a significance. It has a value and a responsibility to a number of stakeholders. Okay? Higher education has a significance and value to all student athletes and basically all college students themselves, to the institutions of higher learning themselves, which is equally as important, and to the community at large, which enjoys the benefits of the existence of college athletics. But what makes college athletics a public trust worth saving? College athletics adds another dimension to the value of institutions of higher learning. College athletics can be compared to other public trusts, like education, the arts, health initiatives, national parks, natural resources, environmental protection, and things similar to that. Now, again, their commonality is that they all serve a broader and positive purpose in society. They require responsible and ethical management and leadership. And they must exist with transparency in the strategic, operational, and fiscal management of public trusts, and that's paramount. In its envisioned, or as I call it, its original state, college athletics serves a societal purpose like the other public trust categories, as I mentioned. In my humble opinion, college sports promotes student engagement, builds student and institutional spirit. It instructs different ways of thinking and analysis by students who participate in college sports. College sports promotes fitness and health among those who participate and even those who are spectators. It promotes values such as perseverance, work ethic, competitive drive, and other values that's coveted by corporate America. And it also builds a sense of community, both locally and nationally. And like the other public trusts that I mentioned, the stakeholders and beneficiaries of that trust are numerous categories within the community at large. Now, sports, regardless of the level, be it professional, collegiate, amateur, and note that college sports may not now be considered amateur. All of that, though, is tightly woven in our American social fabric. And like the other versions of sport, in that fabric, the positive impact of college sports in our society is as historical as it is current. To be deserving of the entitlements due to a public trust, the following elements have to be maintained in current college athletics. Institutions also must conduct education-centric mission, making the education of the students as athletes as primary as any other purpose. Also, the health, safety, and well-being of students participating in athletics should be an objective. Financial transparency and accountability should also characterize the management of resources generated by sports and allow the resources to directly serve the education mission. Also, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That ought to be prominent, a value prominent that's held by those who consider college sports a public trust. And galvanizing communities, as I mentioned, must be a goal in bringing together various community groups on campus in the local and surrounding communities, even among the alumni community, all in an effort towards sustaining ideal community coexistence. So in summary, I believe that in a relationship between institutions of higher learning and its students, and yes, its students, who participate in athletics, the value of an education is sacrosanct, and the commercial use of athletics by colleges and universities should equitably operate to the benefit of those students participating in sports in their quest to achieve all the virtues that I spoke of in earning a degree, and it should do that more than it operates to benefit those who invest in its commercialism. Now, right now, the current premise accepted by the courts is that student athletes are receiving less than their fair share of the bargain, and that the only solution is to literally pay athletes to play. And that threatens the noble college sports ideal as it was once envisioned. Now, for the longest time, I believed that the college sports proposition was simply this, at least philosophically. In exchange for me remaining eligible, providing maximum effort on the practice and playing surface, representing my institution as a good citizen, I would enjoy a subsidized, even free education. Imagine that. And an enhanced leadership development opportunity through competition. For me, sports participation in college would simply be part of the education mission. And I still believe that. However, times, attitudes, and ideas change. And based on several factors that we'll discuss within, I've adjusted my thinking on the process. But as a beneficiary of its promise, the promise of college sports, I believe that the principles, the purpose, and the goals of college athletics should never change. If it is to maintain its position as a public trust, then college sports should, in many ways, require that its values ought to be sustained and warrant protection, a unique protection, one that allows it to maintain its identity and is distinct from pro sports and from other public trusts that are no less valuable but serve different purposes. We've got to assign it an identity that promotes the value of higher education and engenders community engagement, not what we have today. And I'm not alone. There are many advocacy groups whose goal is to preserve the value of college athletics in the development of leaders and the promotion of virtues and principles to be used in bettering our world. The Knight Commission for Intercollegiate Athletics, it can be found at knightcommission.org, for which I proudly serve as a chairperson, is one of those groups. And I know it's shameless self-promotion, but that's what we're going to do. The purpose of the Knight Commission is to develop, promote, and really make sure leading transformational change that prioritizes the education, health, safety, and success of college athletes. And the commission is made up of current and former university presidents, chancellors, university trustees, and other college athletes, as well as nationally regarded thought leaders from organizations with ties to or involvement in higher education and college sports. Indicative of its quest for advocacy for change, in early as 1991, the commission issued a seminal report entitled Keeping Faith with the Student Athlete, a new model for intercollegiate athletics. And this report provided a roadmap for reform and was quickly embraced by higher education leaders. That was 1991. It proposed a governing model where institutional presidents control the direction of sports on their campuses, unlike what's going on today, where they cede authority to athletic directors. By the late 1990s, the NCAA had enacted a majority of the commission's recommendations, seeking to strengthen academic standards and improve athletics governance in the midst of scandals in that vein. At the time, some observers could see that college sports was heading towards a commercialism abyss, and that leaving the education mission was something that was going to occur. But since then, subsequent commission reports and recommendations continue to influence college athletics and contribute to the positive changes that have occurred over the last several decades. Among our recommendations that led major changes, one was requiring teams to track the graduation of at least 50% of their students as athletes to be eligible for NCAA postseason championships and bowl games. They asked them to graduate 50%. Can you imagine what was going on before that? And that would have an impact on academic incentives with regard to the NCAA's distribution. And from that recommendation, we got the APR, the academic performance rate, and we got the graduation success rate as well. All work to increase the graduation of college athletes. And our most recent efforts and research have helped shape public internal discussion about the principles and policies guiding college sports, including rules that allow college athletes to earn compensation from the use of their name, image, and likeness. In the Commission's new report, Connecting Athletic Revenues and Education Model of College Sports, or CARE model, we recommend altering the distribution criteria and uses for funds of the more than $3.5 billion that's distributed annually by the NCAA, the College Football Playoff, and for those of you who don't know what that is, that's the current fiduciary that governs major college football, and also distributions from the Division I conferences. And the CARE model is the newest set of recommendations in the Knight Commission's report entitled Transforming the D1 Model. So the Commission's proposed requirements could be and should be imposed by the respective college sports governing body. It's not the NCAA, but it's something, or from Congress. And that's in line with the responsibility of a public trust. The CARE model would require 4 core principles that guide the distribution, criteria, and accountability for how shared athletics revenues should be spent. And you can see them there. Transparency. How's the money come in? What are we doing with the money? Independent oversight. Not just athletics governing that, but others who can have comment and input. Incentives, distributions that support the core value of education, gender equity, and opportunity. And finally, financial responsibility for student-athlete education, health, safety, and well-being. That the money just doesn't go to building bigger arenas, to paying, through collectors pay for play, and other ways that don't benefit the direct education, health, and safety. Adherence to these core principles in the times of change we're witnessing ought to assure that the originalist purpose of college athletics, enhancing education while protecting that health, safety, and well-being, is preserved. Now, our advocacy, the Knight Commission's advocacy, has had resonance, but we need more support. We need more public opinion weight to help corral the stampede towards pure commercialism and professionalism that we see encroaching on college sports today. And it's brought about by current changes instituted by lawsuits and settlements. So the need for oversight from a strong, equitable governing body, from the institutions themselves, from government, and from advocacy groups like the Knight Commission are extremely important. So, college athletics has proven to be an integral and positive element in the balance of our uniquely American social construct. And as a public trust, along with its qualities and responsibilities, its survival is unquestionably necessary. So the question we face is, can those capabilities, qualities, and responsibilities be preserved for positive results, or will they be subsumed by a runaway locomotive that threatens to obscure and ultimately obliterate the originalist goals of education-centered, community-galvanizing force called college sports? You know, to buttress the conclusion that college sports is a public trust worth saving, it's important for us to review where college athletics has been, how it has evolved, and understand the current revolution in college sports as to where it stands, and also, and this is where I'm going to call on you all later to help me, let's surmise where it's headed. So the history of college athletics. College athletics has always been a subject of irony. We never see athletics mentioned as the feature or mission of an institution of higher education. For schools, particularly the big schools, power conferences, College athletics has an outsized role in institutional revenue generation, use of resources, influence, and of course, in popularity. Often the monuments to athletics are the stadiums, the arenas, and they are also the focal points on campus. But to understand why college sports has become a public trust, let's examine its convoluted history. As early as 1843, colleges felt a need to compete against each other. It began with boat clubs of Yale and Harvard starting regattas, which is pretty interesting. In the 1850s, baseball became a competition vehicle. The first baseball game was played between Amherst and Williams. And note that college sports beginnings are at elite educational institutions with staunch alumni communities and in reasonably close proximity, creating natural and palpable rivalries. That's also part of the allure of college sports, to unify against them. Track and field competitions in the 1870s followed along with soccer and rugby. Football began in 1869 with the first known game between Rutgers and Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey. And the beginnings of college sports also arose from the need for replacement of prior college-mandated physical activity for restless students. Colleges used to mandate that they get out there and work, farm, clear the land, do construction work. It's primarily male, but nevertheless, they found out that they had a lot of time on their hands. All of those were ways to work off energy for those young students. But early, organized college sports was replaced, or did replace, the cruelty of a phenomenon called rushes, where students would savage each other in violent games similar to football, but no equipment. Ironically, in the nascent period of college sport, the student athletes were a significant part of the governance of college sports. In my opinion, some of which is based on conversation with a few of my students who actually served on the NCAA Student Athletic Advisory Committee. And they say that today's student input is diluted to almost nothing, as the NCAA-sponsored Student Athlete Advisory Committee, or SAC as it's called, is just that, an advisory body with no real decision-making or contributing power other than relating experiences on issues affecting student athletes. But back to history. The turn of the century ushered in a new zeal for college sports, particularly football, especially at the Ivy League level. And that zeal was measured by the building of facilities. In 1904, Harvard erected Soldiers Field. At the same time, it was probably considered the largest reinforced concrete structure of its kind. Think of all the building that went on at the turn of the century. One of the largest reinforced concrete structures of its kind was a football field. 10 years later, Yale, not to be outdone by its rival, built its bowl, seating 70,000 spectators. Now that might have been the beginning of the colloquial facilities arms race that we see today, where historically institutions have sought to keep up with and surpass the Joneses in athletic facilities. And that competition continues today. Now, in the roaring 20s, schools that you would not normally associate with sports, they had their heyday. The University of Chicago, led by its president at the time, William Rainey Harper, sought to use sports as a way to connect the campus to the greater community and the greater community through football, hoping to generate attention for the institution, hoping to galvanize the community spirit and generate revenue from that interest. To that end, Harper hired Yale football star Amos Alonzo Stagg as its athletic director. And what Stagg did was proceeded to formulate a plan that allowed athletic departments to operate independent of the university. Athletics reported directly to the president and the board of trustees with no oversight from governance hierarchy. University facilities there generated revenue from outside sources, including high school competitions, sports camps, and other entertainment sources. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In my opinion, Stagg's plan was the basis for what we see today in the operation of college sports programs on the highest level. To see the origin, the promise, and the evolution of college sports commercialism in this recounting is obvious. Yale's athletic director, Walter Camp, considered the father of college football, during that same period developed a control over a lucrative sports enterprise with little accountability to the school administration, the students, or the public. Now, when you look at that, no accountability, you start to realize that unregulated power often leads to abuse. And both on and off the field, so many things started to occur. Cheating both on and off the field, loose safety regulations of how football and other games were played, pay-for-play scandals. All of those had a stronghold on big-time college sports in the early 20th century. It's peculiar how history has a penchant for repeating itself. Injuries, deaths, corruption in the playing of games and operation of athletic departments are among so many instances that threaten to destroy the spiritual community value and even the commercial value of college sports. So this was the crisis and the chaos that led the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, a college football fanatic, to seek order and regulation in college sports. So what he commanded was the development of an organization originally named the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States in 1906. The NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, was formed in 1910. Yet even this new organization could not fully tame the corrupt and commercial beasts known as college football. In 1929, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching released a study asking for college presidents to regain control of college sports and take it away from outsiders, which included commercial entities and alumni boosters. From that outcry came conferences and commissioners who put forth regulations. So let's recognize that the problems we see in college sports today had its precursors. And actions to eliminate the forces that mutilated the original virtues of college sports did not apply themselves until there was crisis and chaos. Now, after World War II, there was another assault on the integrity of college sports. And that was gambling, point shaving, recruiting violations, and other forms of cheating. The University of Kentucky and City College of New York, CCNY, in 1948 and 1951 respectively, were the most notable and most publicized examples. And what they did was demonstrate the importance of integrity in college sports and affirmed college sports' identity as a public trust. It was law enforcement and the government's interest in clean competitions that defined the public trust and the interest in it. Now, you've heard the term student athlete, right? It wasn't always part of the lexicon. Its origin came out of a need to escape liability by avoiding the label of employee or worker for students who played NCAA sports. Walter Byers, then NCAA president, developed a label to counter a workers' compensation insurance claim that would have had far-reaching effect on NCAA liability for athlete health and safety in the mid-1950s. The term student athlete was born as the NCAA defended itself against a claim by the widow of a gentleman by the name of Ray Dennison, who died while playing football in 1954. His widow likened college football to a full-time job and argued that his death should be covered by state labor laws. So even then, there were claims that college sports participation was a job and that athletes were employees. But Byers and the NCAA lawyers advanced the defense that Dennison was a student athlete who engaged in extracurricular activity that just happened to be more dangerous than other student activities. And surprisingly, and in comparison to today's legal reasoning, the courts agreed. They agreed with Byers and the NCAA. And so since then, the label student athlete has become the catchphrase for defining college sports as inherently non-commercial and certainly not employment. While that term could be defended in 1958, today it has no relevance except as a label in today's hyper-commercialized college athletics industry. Now, the growth of college sports in the 1960s and 1970s was punctuated by a growth in commercialism through media rights valuations and the desire of other sports athletes beyond football and basketball to receive scholarships. Parallel with the fight for civil rights in the 1960s and 70s was the quest for equal treatment for non-revenue generating sports, as well as the growing number of women's sports. That quest applied particularly in women's sports, whose participation numbers grew, and the desire for scholarship numbers on par with men also grew. Now, these additional and heretofore ignored costs to adding scholarships for women's sports placed a heavy burden on a number of athletic department budgets and on their imaginations and creativity. In 1972, Title IX was born and became law of the land. And Title IX prohibited discrimination on the basis of gender. In the simplest terms, Title IX provides the right to equal opportunity in sports in all institutions that receive government funding. Title IX called for the effective accommodation of student interests and abilities, which meant increased participation. The law also called for athletic assistance, in other words, equitable scholarships, as well as equal benefits and treatment in those scholarships. Title IX does not require equal expenditures of funds, but the spending of dollars proportional to participation numbers. So, for example, if $1 million is available in a budget for scholarships, and when you take a look at the numbers of participation between men and women, and it's 50-50, then $500,000 needs to go to each. The participation ratio is what determines equitable expenditure. Moreover, to also be in compliance, all an institution has to do is demonstrate consistency in expanding sports opportunities for the unrepresented gender. And finally, the third piece that allows an institution to be in compliance is demonstrate that it fully met the institution's sports participation interests in the underrepresented gender. So if there are sports out there that young women wanted to participate in, the institution has to make an effort to get involved in that. Fulfilling any of those three that I mentioned puts an institution in compliance with Title IX. So Title IX is key as we continue through the history of college sports and recognize its impact. The interpretation of the impact and law and more money on equitable application will certainly be important as we go forward. Now, believe it or not, there have been periods of enlightenment by the NCAA. In 1956, the NCAA divided itself into two divisions, the university division for larger schools and the college division for smaller schools. Later in 1973, the NCAA again reorganized into three divisions, and their enlightened purpose was aligning schools with similar levels of emphasis in competition and sport philosophies as they relate to that school. Division I was the highest level of competition, and they also had the highest and the largest athletic budgets. Division II schools seemed to have more balance between sport and academics, less training intensity, and a lesser emphasis on scholarship aid. And Division III schools had the smallest budgets, no scholarships, but they had a focus on developing opportunities for all students to participate. And the growth of community interest in college sports, particularly football, is what fueled the rise for the lucrative nature of TV media rights and commercialism. And when that started to happen, that's when the NCAA, instead of acting like a public trust in protection, they started to look like entrepreneurs. That's when they sought to control the media rights, including how many games would be broadcast, which games, and which networks. Thus, the legal case that opened the door to the antitrust cases that have begun to decimate the current NCAA authority is NCAA versus Board of Regents, Oklahoma University. In 1984, the Supreme Court ruled that the NCAA position of trying to control football media rights was a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, one that the NCAA couldn't reasonably justify to maintain competitive balance as it was required by law. Supreme Court Justice Byron White, a former collegiate All-American, argued in a prescient dissent that the NCAA TV plan was not anti-competitive, but reasonably designed to promote football as an amateur sport, that students who play college sports are integrated into the academic structure and not erstwhile mercenaries. White decried the court's error in, quote, treating intercollegiate athletics under the NCAA as a purely commercial venture in which colleges and universities participate solely or even primarily in the pursuit of profits, close quote. White observed that the stated mission of the NCAA membership was competitive athletics and should remain a vital part of the education mission. Moreover, in his dissent, White observed that without any authoritative regulatory effort, quote, a persistent and inevitable desire to win at all costs, close quote, would create excesses, the current excesses like we see now in capital expenditure, facilities arms races, academic fraud, and other harmful and exploitive actions that hurt students and damage the competitions in which those students participated. Now, from my observation, I believe Justice White forecast college athletics and the world in which they exist today. He opined that when correctly positioned, the NCAA exists primarily to enhance the contribution made by intercollegiate competition to the process of higher education, as distinguished from realizing maximum return on an entertainment commodity. In other words, White was saying that the NCAA is there to assure that athletics remains a part of the education mission, not simply a form of entertainment to be exploited for profit. But as time marched on and commercialism expanded, even the NCAA was seduced by the money. So that was 1984. The question is, did the NCAA protect the public trust of college athletics, or did it allow it to become a victim of commercialism run amok? Let's now talk about the revolution of college athletics. Today, schools and conferences negotiate their own media deals, with the SEC and Big Ten earning the lion's share. Through the college football playoff and with other media entities, the SEC and the Big Ten have more financial clout than the NCAA, which controls, the NCAA only controls the NCAA champion product. And that includes the men and women's basketball tournament, the College Baseball World Series, and a host of other sports championships, including those of Olympic sports. And from the day of the Oklahoma Board of Regents decision, college sports and media entities began to accelerate the growth of college sports, mostly football and basketball. And they did it on every media and sponsorship platform available. The development and growth of the internet acted as jet fuel to the commercialism of college sports. And with that newfound financial largesse, an earnest debate began to mushroom. Whether or not college sports now is more a money revenue generator and forsaking its original education mission or not. Revenue for athletic departments grew from conference and NCAA's increased distribution. And increased distributions led to greater expenditures on coaches' salaries. By example, you take a look here. Public school head football coaches, their salaries are projected to surpass student benefit aid, which is essentially scholarships. This is part of the revolutionary commercialism of college sports. And if they have it, athletic departments will spend it, even when the coaching relationships fail. It's like monopoly money. Take a look. Between 2012 and 2022, over $500 million has been paid to coaches, not to coach. Can you imagine what that distribution could do for student athletes? What it could do for the education mission? What it could do for the university itself? Now, those distributions, that amount of money comes from CFP distributions, the amount of money that they've been able to garner through television rights. And it was also derived from the growth of the men's basketball tournament. And again, no direct enrichment for athletes, particularly those athletes that are responsible for the blocking and tackling, the screening and rolling that earns the entertainment and commercial dollar. And for athletes, all of them, the increased opportunities to exploit their likeness in a marketplace that puts value on those likenesses were also denied due to NCAA rules. The right of publicity, which is the right to use your likeness, to capitalize on your own likeness, already available to non-athlete students, was abrogated by NCAA rules. And that was done in an effort to maintain a losing proposition called amateurism. But inequities have a habit of catching up to institutions. And when placed against the backdrop of skyrocketing coaches' salaries, facilities arms races, the environment and time was right for another challenge to the NCAA's autocracy in college sports. So, in 2014, Ed O'Bannon, former player at UCLA, the named plaintiff in a case versus the NCAA and EA Sports, a video game creator and an NCAA sponsor, Ed O'Bannon prevailed in a trial where the judge ruled that the NCAA violated antitrust laws by denying him the right to take advantage of his name, image, and likeness. Now, one would have thought that that was the wake-up call the NCAA needed to adjust its thinking and change policy to preserve and legitimize its regulatory power. Unfortunately, and in my humble opinion, institutional arrogance and bad advice prevailed, as it always does when the power structure is in the midst of a revolution. And the NCAA had its chance to take ownership, regulate NIL, and maintain at least some semblance of regulatory power. But nope. In a fit of hubris, it did not. It continued to rely on the argument that college sports needed that abrogation so that they can maintain amateurism. Now, the remedy in the O'Bannon case ordered the NCAA to offer full cost of attendance scholarships, which is the value of a scholarship beyond room, board, and tuition, as well as cover the cost of living expenses that were not currently part of an NCAA scholarship. Included were payments up to a maximum of $5,000. And the Supreme Court ultimately denied the NCAA's appeal, and they were ordered to pay $40 million in legal fees and costs above and beyond the damages. So this Supreme Court ruling is what ushered in the now well-known age of NIL, or name, image, and likeness. But we can go further. In 2021, the NCAA was sued by a student whose last name is Alston for reasons that they limited the opportunity to get compensation that essentially was education related. Same thing, violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, the ruling did place limits on the amount of education-related compensation, but what it was a stepping stone towards an even bigger case. Legal scholars believe that when combined with the principles of antitrust law, it considered Alston to be the basis along which college athlete employment cases could become successful in a challenge. In 2023, the NCAA recorded almost $1.3 billion with net assets of $565 million after distribution. And that revenue consisted of $929 million in TV rights payments, mostly from ESPN, $222 million from ticket sales in the championships that they govern and postseason events, including March Madness, and $16 million in sponsorship. And from that revenue, approximately $650 million went back to the membership through the conferences. Upcoming is a new $920 million TV deal with ESPN that'll cover the NCAA championships, including women's basketball, their equivalent of March Madness. However, the litigation and the settlements continue to face the NCAA is going to place a tremendous burden on the organization and its distribution capability to its membership. And in turn, it's going to hurt athletic departments, except for a number of institutions that are probably aligned with the Power Four conferences, big-time football. But everyone else is going to feel it. The most challenging litigation is the 2024 settlement from the House versus NCAA case. That was filed in 2020, and it took this long to reach a settlement. Had the NCAA gone to court and lost, as was their track record over the last several decades, they would have had to pay treble damages, 3 times the amount of damages. Grant House, a University of Arizona swimmer, along with Sedona Prince, a women's college basketball player, were plaintiffs in House versus NCAA. And they sought back pay damages for athletes, primarily football and men's basketball athletes who are receiving this, and revenue sharing going forward based on the NCAA's prohibition of NIL payments to athletes prior to 2021 when they made it legal. That action alleged antitrust violations once again in the prohibition of NIL rights. Now, the settlement in-house, contested by some potential plaintiffs, but preliminarily approved by the presiding judge, Claudia Wilkins, that settlement will have a profound and far-reaching effect on college sports and its finances and its budgets, particularly, as I said, institutions not in the SEC or the Big Ten. And it calls for the NCAA to pay $1.1 billion, with a B, in back pay to former athletes, while schools would pay the remainder, approximately $1.65 billion. And those are athletes who played from 2016 until 2021. The Power Four conferences, the Big Ten, the SEC, ACC, and the Big 12, and the former Pac-12 would ante up 40%, and the remaining 27 Division I conferences would pay the other 60%, or 60% of $1.65 billion. Money is coming out of the Ohio University athletic budget. Football and men's basketball, players who played between 2016 and 2021 would receive the bulk of the $2.8 billion in total. And the settlement also creates a revenue sharing formula that's going to allow schools to share directly with the athletes, up to 22% of the average of the media ticket and sponsorship revenue gathered by the powerful conferences in total. That number is projected to be around $20 million in the 25-26 calendar year. The settlement also allows third-party scrutiny over NIL payments of over $600, and that's the only place where the NCAA retains some regulatory power. But athletes can opt out or object to terms of this settlement by January 31st, 2025. So this settlement may not end litigation. In fact, the NCAA can still die a death by 1,000 litigation cuts. But none of the House settlement points address whether athletes are employees. That debate regarding that employee status began in 2014 in earnest when the Northwestern University athletes were granted employee status by the National Labor Relations Board regional director in Chicago. Gave them the right to unionize. But in 2015, and this tells you how political the NLRB can be, the national office overruled that determination, believing that it would create an imbalance in competition and labor instability in NCAA football. Now, in order to determine if you're an employee or not, the NLRB uses a standard test to determine who's an employee. And that test applies only to private institutions. Another test that applies to both public and private is the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA. And in July 2024, Johnson versus NCAA, that case was brought in front of the Court of Appeals of the Third Circuit. And the Third Circuit held that college athletes may be employees based on their 4-point employee economic realities test. And that test is as follows. Does one party perform services for another? Are those services primarily for the other party's benefit? Is the person under the control of the other party? And does that other party receive compensation or benefits in exchange for the service? Think about college athletes. Those of you who are athletes, put yourself through that prism. What do you think? This ruling severely dents arguments of amateurism and places athletes in a new class that will have rights of employees, including unionization and collective bargaining. Certainly, there are other legal cases in the hopper or being constructed, as the House settlement will have objectors and opt-outs who are in effect reserving their right to file claims on their own. But with all of this, this is where we are, folks. This is where we are and where we've been in college sports. And these strategies, through lawsuits and other actions, create far more questions than they do answers. Questions like, where will college sports be in 5 years, in 10 years? Will it even exist? Will there be a central governing body? Will it be the NCAA? Will it be something else? Or has antitrust law rendered centralized regulation obsolete in college sports? Will athletes be merely workers who are compensated to perform tasks? Or will they, along with the institution, remain tied to the education model and academic eligibility? Will the public be able to distinguish college sports from the pro sports? We have so many elements now invading college sports that are just like the pros. Will the haves among institutions like those in the SEC and the Big Ten and some other major football and basketball conferences, will they break off and form super leagues governed by their own rules, guided by their common and aligned interests? Most importantly, will Congress get involved? Crisis and chaos once had the President of the United States involved. Most importantly, is college sports and its original purpose ever going to be recognized again? So this completes my foray into the history and complexity of college athletics. As I said, certainly there'll be more questions to be asked, and hopefully they'll get asked here today. But also, hopefully through those questions, not only as you ask me, but ask of each other. What do you think? Because as I said before, greater public advocacy, whether college sports is worth saving as a public trust, whether it's worth saving in a manner that that provides for the education, health, safety, and well-being of the student athlete, that is centered on education, that creates a community that unifies behind one cause. You guys may differ politically, but when it comes to the Bobcats, you're all in. Oh, aren't you? Okay. And that's the importance of college sports. So now, I thank you for your attention. It's time to open up this forum and allow you to ask, share, and otherwise contribute into peeping into the future of college sports. I think there are mics at each end if you have a question, if you have a statement, if you want to challenge anybody else, please feel free to do so.
Hi, Len. It's okay?
Yeah, Dave, that's great.
Hi, Len. Great talk. I'm Dr. David Path from the College of Business, and really enjoyed some of the things that you had to say. And I know we talked earlier, Len, that I've always said, regardless of what happens, people will always watch college sports. And I use the example of 70 miles up the road is a pretty big university. It's a pretty big stadium that I tell my students, and I'll tell a few here if they haven't heard it, of the 20 biggest field sports stadiums in the world, 10 of them are American college football stadiums. None of them are NFL stadiums, not one. So I would always contend that it's always been professional sports, Len. And I wonder, as we mentioned earlier, should we have the educational connection the way that we have it now, or could we potentially do it in another way? If I gave you the keys to the kingdom, Len, how would you structure college sports going forward, especially under these new restrictions that we have?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. The way I look at it, NIL, when regulated, should absolutely be involved. I think that now with the comparison of coaches' salaries to the lack of student-athlete involvement or athlete involvement, I think that athletes should share in the pie. But I still believe that we can be education-centered and allow athletes to not only matriculate, but also play. And the reason I say that is because I still see involvement in the institution as leadership development. And that's what we're after. We can have minor leagues in football. If that's what people want to do, fine. But we also need to have an opportunity for those who aren't going to go forward to professional sports. We need an opportunity for them to not only take advantage of the things like NIL and to be paid for the burden that they assume as athletes, but also to give them a chance to get better as people. And so from that standpoint, I think it makes more sense. And also, I think it galvanizes the community to know that those same people on the gridiron are a part of the university as opposed to being mere mercenaries. And that's just my opinion. I think that that's what pulls people together. And knowing people will go and watch Ohio State even from here, but a lot of it knows that they're students. They're just like us. Maybe we went to high school with them. We may not have played, they may not be playing for our school. Now, sometimes I wonder, it's a place to be also. So, that has something to do with it. But again, that's galvanizing the community. I still think, and I've always said this, to give the fair share based upon their contribution to athletes who happen to be students is fair, but don't take the discipline away. Don't take the rewards away. And I'm not talking about pecuniary rewards. I'm talking about the rewards of development, the rewards of knowledge, and the rewards of building careers. Remember I talked about things like perseverance, things like creative thinking, things like work ethic. All those things are coveted by corporate America. And we need to discipline our athletes, which is something we haven't done because of the chase for the commercial dollar. Eligibility standards had been lax for a long time until graduation, the academic performance rate and the graduation success rate measured. And even then, it's not fully pushing athletes towards being all they can be in the classroom. And I think there's a balance to be had. But I understand what you're saying. People are always going to watch it, at least for a period of time, until there's no more connection. And when the community becomes disconnected, then I don't think people are going to watch anymore. I think it loses its value. Anyone else? She beat you. No, just...
As someone who, can everyone hear me first? Oh, good. Okay, it's working. Good. As someone who is both a teaching assistant in the history department, as well as someone who works in the private sector wing of student housing, I can only envision what kind of mutating monster the more commercialization of college sports is going to occur in terms of what someone who will most likely, the way the courts seem to be going, be listed as an employee of the institution, be expected. If you're arguing under the assumption that the purpose of the student athlete attending college is also to receive a first-rate education, as do their non-athletic peers, an expectation to get something as a benefit of playing sports for the institution, in my opinion, would work to de-incentivize top-tier academic performance, as well as maybe put some undue pressures, particularly as more finances come in, on academics to maybe potentially be a little easier on some of the college athletes. As well as I do know that here at OU, college athletes, their ability to live off campus is a reward for good academics. If you do not achieve a certain GPA standard, you get put back into the dorms. As an employee of the institution, I could see that incentive basically becoming null and void because they can always say, hey, I'm taking my business elsewhere. I'm just wondering what kind of protections can be put in place for the institutions as a whole to kind of push against some of the disintegration of the NCAA standards in an effort to protect the integrity of the institution as a place for academic learning to benefit the college athletes as well as the community as a whole.
Well, it's a great question as to the protections for the institution to be able to do the right thing. And quite honestly, there's an awful lot of leeway for institutions now. The problem is, will they take the stand and create rules within, their purview? It might be different from other schools. See, one of the biggest problems with schools is that they don't want to do things that might, chase away the great athletes. And so therefore, they're reticent to speak out on what they need to do to assure a quality education, to provide incentive, to provide discipline, to maybe even disincentivize certain actions and certain behaviors. The question is, again, it goes back to leadership, in my opinion. And as we've asked back in the early 90s, as it was asked earlier than that, presidents need to grab control and not just leave it to athletics directors, and not to take anything away from athletics directors, but they're judged by how much revenue they bring in, and that's directly attributable to how successful the teams are. And so in order to do that, you need players, and you need to be able to establish rules that aren't going to chase them away, but actually are going to attract them. But are those rules the ones that ultimately result in them getting a quality experience in education? Where are they going to be 10 years from now? I think that's the focus. And it's up to the governing forces, the true governing forces, presidents and boards of trustees, to take a stand and make a decision. So the fear of losing out on revenue, I'm not sure that's going to happen anymore. Think realignment. That's the whole purpose for realignment, to get with a conference that's got a great TV deal so you can make money. But once you're there, to the extent that you can be there, okay, now what's stopping you from establishing rules that ultimately are going to educate, which should be the mission? You know, coaches and others, objectively, certainly you want to judge them on how well the athletes are doing in class, as well as how well they're doing on the playing surface. But subjectively, and that should also be a review process, what are they doing 5 years from now? What have your athletes done 5 years, 8, 10 years from now? Because this has direct impact. Their experience here has direct impact on that. I hope that answers your question. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Professor Elmore. Thank you for being here. And I'm anxious to hear our student questions. But from my perspective, I'm curious, with your perspective and background as a student, an athlete, a lawyer, and now academic, how has that shaped your view of college athletics?
Well, I mean, a good question. And like I said, shameless self-promotion. I can't argue with any experience that I've had. People think that it was such a smooth road. I remember as a freshman, I broke my kneecap, tore my patellar tendon. These are days when freshmen weren't eligible. I won't even want to tell you how long ago that was. But I was told by the doctor I had a 50-50 chance of playing basketball again. And at that time, I was despondent. I was ready to leave because I thought I was there to play basketball. I was 18 years old. I didn't want to go to class. Got this big cast on my knee. But I started to realize, okay, what's going to happen if I don't graduate? What's going to happen with the time that I've spent here? And I had dreams beyond being a professional athlete. You know, I was a fan of Perry Mason. I wanted to be a lawyer. And so there's no way in the world I would get there. And that, I think, is the important thing. You know, what I try to pass on is the idea of having dreams and aspirations that are beyond the areas where you are chosen. I was chosen. I was drafted. That's what a draft is. They choose you. But I could choose to be what I wanted to be. And I think that's the attitude we need to instill in our athletes, because they're given opportunities that non-athletes aren't. Leadership through competition. There's nothing like it. And so all of that has informed, those experiences have informed every decision that I've made down the road. Some of them been good, some of them not so good. But nevertheless, the idea that it was my education, my application, ultimately. You remember, I played 10 years in the NBA, and then I went to law school because it was something I wanted. It was something I needed. And every athlete, there are athletes who want it more, probably want it more than I do. Translate that into the career aspirations. And for you faculty out here, that's a role that you certainly can play as well in support, to be able to continually challenge them to want more than just what's on the playing field. I hope that answers. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Holden Creel. I'm a student here at Ohio University. And I was kind of wondering about the difference between like why colleges are a program and why they're not just like a step between, you know, going pro. Famously, like Nick Saban and Coach K have said that they like hardly recognize the sport anymore because students are coming in and, you know, they're just here as the step between going pro. Do you think that colleges and pro leagues should institute, you know, getting rid of like the one and done where it's like you can't just go into a program, play there for a year and go in? I feel like if they're there for, you know, 2-3 years, students will respect a program more, and I feel like that'll build a stronger trust between the athletes and their coaches, and it'll, you know, make their decision more definite, you know, where they want to go and why they're there.
Well, that is a possibility, but remember, in football, you have to be, what is it, a sophomore, or you have to be a junior in order to get into the NFL. In basketball, which is what you were talking about, certainly, you know, removing that 1 year would have some impact. You know, those who want to go, but those who want to go and don't want to go to college, they already have things like overtime and some of these other leagues that they can join without absolutely going to college to play. The idea of staying with a program 1-2 years and gaining some loyalty to it, you know, that was, you know, kind of thrown out the window when the transfer portal allowed people to leave after every year without having to sit out. So we made it easier for student athletes to leave and to go elsewhere. I think the idea, though, is strengthening, even in transfer, strengthening the academic requirement. You know, we've seen it with some athletes. A great example is Caleb Love, who played at North Carolina, wanted to transfer to Michigan, but couldn't do it because his North Carolina credits didn't translate to Michigan. So what does that say about North Carolina? So, you know, in those instances, I think you make it tougher for them to transfer, even though you give them that opportunity to transfer, make the academic rigor such that, you know, maybe they think twice about leaving until they strengthen their academic credentials. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. Otherwise, it's hard to restrict the movement of these young people. But I hear what you're saying with regard to developing a culture. That's also up to the coaches and the staff and the team to embrace. I look at a school that doesn't allow transfers. And now they're ranked in the top 25 for the first time in I don't know how many years, and that's Navy in football. And a lot of it has to do with building the culture, you know, and getting young men to be able to buy in to what is being taught and having them progress. So a lot of what you said is absolutely true. The question is, you know, I don't know if we can put the toothpaste back in the tube. So,
Thank you.
sure.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Yes, sir. You're the boss. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I've noticed some pretty significant disparities between men and women athletes with NIL. What do you think going forward would be a good step to make sure that women have a more equitable side of NIL?
Well, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of steps that can be done, simply because, again, you're talking about a marketplace, the free market. And unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, football and men's basketball get the lion's share. But you do have, you know, some women's basketball players who have competed very well in the NIL space. You've had women gymnasts and volleyball players and others. It really depends on how they value the persona, the likeness. Some of them, some of the highest earners aren't that visible, at least as players. And I'm talking about men and women, but they're influencers. They're on social media. They've gathered a following. And that's what commercial entities are really interested in. My biggest worry is people who continue to try to be that influencer to the detriment of studies, to the detriment of practice, and to the detriment of their mental health. I think that is a huge problem. You know, we put so much value on that. You know, if NIL is what you're looking for, obviously there are agents out there that you can hire. I've never been in favor of agents around college athletes, but, you know, that's what's available right now. And, you know, that's what their job is, to go out and sell you. And to take the pressure off of you. But as I said, I just don't see the marketplace changing until women's sports grows, and I'm talking about particularly basketball, volleyball. In some areas, like Nebraska, you can fill a 100,000-seat arena to watch volleyball. And I guarantee you those women who play volleyball are doing pretty well at NIL. There are other places where you're not getting that. LSU, you have a gymnast who's been a leader in NIL, but you don't have that in other places. So I think that's the dictates of the marketplace. And even beyond college sports, we see what is going on. So, When the marketplace changes, I think we're going to probably have, more equitable distribution of NIL money. But until it just changes, there's not a whole lot I think that we can do, unless you're the public and you clamor for more women. That's about the biggest thing. That's what sells. That's what pushes, from a commercial standpoint, that's what pushes sponsors in the direction, the public.
Should there be a salary cap or a Title IX intervention?
I'm not sure under Title IX it can be, because those sponsors don't receive federal funds. So that's one thing. And when you say a salary cap, I don't know how you arbitrarily cap NIL dollars, because it's not coming from. Now, when institutions start giving the money away and they directly track it, that's a whole different story. But until that happens, I don't see what much you can do.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do we still have time? Okay. I want to return to David's first kind of question in some ways. Where does the solution, it's not entirely clear what the solution is, but you've given us some good ideas to think about it, but where does the solution need to come from? Does it need to be new court decisions that go back to your 1984 white dissent and say, this is how we should start thinking of it? Does it need to be NCAA sort of seizing whatever they can find in terms of regulation? Is it going to take Congress? What can Congress do? Does it take the president? Why hasn't it happened yet, I guess? There's a lot of different questions kind of embedded in there. But if you do have what are the pathways? What is it that people should be advocating for? Where should they be advocating?
All right, well, great question and a great one to end on. I think there have been a lot of ideas on how to transform the model to be equitable, not only for athletes, but also between men and women, but also for institutions, the haves and the have-nots. I think that if we think of the ideas that have been advanced, everything that you said, a little bit of all of that. I think first it begins with, as I've always believed, you have to have some kind of strong regulatory body that's given the power to write the rules, that's gained input from what has happened over the last 10 years and see the best path. Right now, if one body does that and everybody agrees, all of a sudden they get sued for violation of antitrust and colluding to fix prices, if you will. But if Congress steps in, and it's probably going to take something of the magnitude of chaos and crisis, if Congress ultimately steps in and says, okay, and this is just my idea, we'll give you a conditional antitrust exemption, provided that these factors are continued to stay in your sites. The education element, the health, safety, and things that lead to the success of the student athlete. And you balance that with the commercial factor. We'll give you that antitrust exemption so that you can't be interrupted, in doing so. And monitor that over, a period of time. That if you don't do it, then our antitrust exemption will sunset. I've always thought that, but Congress doesn't seem willing to be involved. It becomes kind of a football, no pun intended, back and forth, between the parties and at times of stress and non-stress. When NIL first came out, state legislatures, particularly California and other places that had strong ties to their colleges and their football teams, passed a lot of things that inured to the benefit of those particular colleges. If they got more involved in protecting the students as well, maybe we find a solution. But I think it all begins with several of the things that you just said, and mix it in with some kind of protection so it can be enacted. Because right now, individually, many of those things can't be enacted without making themselves amenable to lawsuit. And that's been the toughest thing. The world has changed based upon antitrust lawsuit, based upon plaintiff lawyers. And as a lawyer, I say that You know, I say that grudgingly. But that's probably where it's going to have to change, legislation as much as anything else. Unless the NCAA kind of fades away, the conferences, the college playoff that's distributing the bulk of the money to the power conferences as well as Division I FBS, you know, they may have to see the light, but they won't. Because they're an entertainment group. Their idea is to collect and you know, to build and gain as much revenue as they possibly can. And it's because the conferences that have the greatest impact, the SEC and the Big Ten, are driving them to do that. So it's complex. I wish I did have an answer. That's why I put it on you guys to help us out with the answer. But there's so many things to do, but I hope in understanding the history and the current state that is food for thought of how we can change it. And as I said before, the Knight Commission is one advocacy group. There are others. The Drake Group, there are several others that are looking to reform college sports to the benefit of student athletes. But it's also going to take your voices, if nothing else. Because in the end, it's still about the community, and you guys have the power. So once again, thanks. This has been great hanging with you guys, and hopefully you learned something.
All right.